Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the last session of Dissecting Diversity in STEM, where we talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion in STEM. Today, our speaker is Christy Johnson, and I'm going to quickly go through, give you guys a rundown of the schedule. So John will be speaking for about half an hour, and then there'll be 15 minutes at the end of a Q&A session. So just feel free to put any questions into the chat and we can address them at the end. So you can put them during the presentation or afterwards. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Christy Johnson. So John is an MD, M.Sc biomedical engineering candidate at the University of Alberta. He works at the Rehabilitation and Robotics Lab at the U of A on a thesis project incorporating elements of telerehabilitation, virtual reality, and wheelchair biomechanics. So thank you so much for joining us, John. I'll hand it over to you now.
Perfect. Thank you, Zena, for that kind introduction. And I'll just get my presentation here. Just let me know if you can see my screen there. How's that look?
It's
perfect.
Visible.
Awesome. All right. So, hi, everyone. As Zena just mentioned, my name is Christy Johnson, and I'm a master's in biomedical engineering and medical student at the University of Alberta. I'd just like to start off by thanking the organizers, Ryan, for inviting me to talk about my experiences as an immigrant and person of color, and everyone else for planning this event in spite of the circumstances. So Rajan and Zenat, thank you. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming out this Thursday afternoon and are potentially excited and interested in seeing what STEM fields, grad school, med school research is like. When I first got invited to this talk, I tried to think of what I would have liked to know 6 years ago when I was just an impressionable, fresh out of high school graduate. And I personally think a lot of the lessons I learned were thanks to my experiences. And I think telling that story would have given me the perspective I needed to get through my journey a little bit easier. So without further ado, I'd just like to tell you all today about the journey I embarked on. If you come across any questions about entrepreneurship, medicine, grad school, research, in the meantime, type them down in the chat and I'll try to address them at the end of the talk. Now, it's hard to talk about my journey without telling you first about my identical twin brother. So this is Peter on the left. Oh, sorry, I meant right. Get confused myself. Haha. As twins, we got compared almost to the point of exhaustion. And with the same genetics and growing up with the same experiences, we were more similar than we were different. We got into fights because we wanted the same things. And on the flip side, we also agreed more about what we wanted because we were interested in many of the same things. Nevertheless, these experiences really made me think about originality and ingenuity a lot. So I'll ask you all a question. How do you define ingenuity? And that's just a rhetorical question. So Merriam-Webster Dictionary says it's the quality of being original, inventive, and clever. In a way, I think growing up with someone who looks, talks, and walks the same way as you do has made me want to forge my own original identity. And so this creativity is really what I believe allowed me to part ways academically with my brother when I chose to do a master's in biomedical engineering, and he chose to do one in pediatrics. In some senses, I think it's truly remarkable that we have identical interests in virtually everything, but we still chose differently. Now, both of us were really motivated by the idea of play, maybe because we were at heart playful people. In fact, one of the things we did was create an after-school play program for children. Anyways, Peter was more focused on children and how they grew resilient with play, while I was more enticed by the mechanics of playground physics. The motion and maneuverability you needed to swing from bar to bar on the monkey bars fascinated me and made me wonder about the muscle circuitry and coordination you needed to do something like that, and maybe rationally its development later on in life. So this interest, coupled with my drive in industry, is really what led me to pursue STEM. So where did this drive in industry come from? Well, trying to pinpoint motivational drive is a futile task. I think we're all really complex creatures with wants and desires that momentarily and dynamically change. After all, sometimes the only reason is serendipity and luck. That being said, I think one factor in this multivariate equation has to do with my upbringing, and it's something that I think a lot of immigrants, refugees, and migrants may relate to on a smaller or larger scale. So we grew up in a small residential outskirts in India as children and immigrated to Canada in 2003 with our parents. A huge motivation for them was that we would get a better education in Canada and enjoy a higher quality of living. I believe overall they were right. Compared to the impoverished areas in India, I began to understand how fortunate I was to live here. Throughout school, this is what really gave me that industry. People would laugh at my peculiarities and mannerisms and languages, how I said V's as W's, but I remembered my privilege and worked even harder, not complaining about the circumstances. So, this attitude of mine really made me into someone that was fairly unsociable, but also goal driven until about my second year of my undergraduate science degree. At this point, I began to do a little bit more lab hopping and really tried to explore the realm of STEM to see what I was really interested in. So, I believe what is truly necessary to STEM is an openness to curiosity, or a type of dilettantism. Now, a dilettante is a person who cultivates interest in an area without any real commitment or knowledge. So, at this stage, you can sort of think about it for people who are into cell biology. You're like an undifferentiated cell. But just like cells, you'll be exposed to different signals from your surroundings and internally that guide your development. But just like there are some cells that differentiate into essential structural tissue and others that become functional ones, you have to figure out what best suits your intrinsic and extrinsic needs. For example, what's the economy like if I have a certain profession in this field? Would I be personally satisfied and interested in this work? You have to consider all these things prior to making that selection. That being said, you also have to remember that some cells turn rogue, some become cancerous, and some become dysfunctional. So, how can you prevent yourself from growing resentful of the educational and professional systems in place? Part of it involves exposing yourselves to new things and taking risks. Now, I believe one of the worst things you can do to people to get them to is to get them to stay in their comfort zones. So this is one thing that turns a lot of people away from STEM. In fact, I encountered a lot of this when I first started research. I would go to what we call wet labs, where a lot of their day may involve being in a dark room trying to look at immunohistochemistry slides and cells under a confocal microscope. I realized quickly that this was not what drew me personally. I began to develop seasonal affective disorder, so a problem associated with spending extended periods of time in low light areas. And this was a time when I was going through several life adversities that I'd rather not get into, but all in all, it took quite a toll on my mental health and sort of pushed me away from STEM. In fact, it forced me to think about the bigger picture. Was I really doing the right thing in STEM? The results I got from my Western blot seem to be insignificant in the bigger scheme of things when you're delivering therapeutics to patients. I didn't feel like I was making an impact at all. I was having an existential crisis. This is when I decided to look at dry labs and engineering. I'd always avoided them out of fear that it may require a lot of physics, which I knew I wasn't very strong at. But other times I would be bogged down by the throes of the dog eat dog world of academia, where often it means to publish or perish. Nevertheless, I decided to expand my horizons and apply to a robotics lab, the Rehab Robotics Lab at the U of A, and rediscovered my love for STEM. Here I was able to engage with people in rehab, graphic design, and engineering, and see the impacts of my works as patients and students came to our labs and got super hyped about the technology and projects. After I graduated, I had to make a decision about whether I should continue studying or enter industry. The problem, I felt that I lacked the skill to enter industry, but if I avoided it, I may not acquire these skills at all. So it was the ultimate catch 22. So I decided what a rational person would do. I did both. I started masters with a lab I joined and started a startup with a few of my lab mates at the same time. I could tell you I'm a scientist, engineer, entrepreneur, healthcare worker, and a student, but I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. And I actually am going to make a case that you shouldn't need to worry about boundaries in discipline. In fact, by associating yourself with a particular discipline, you can bar yourself off from potential discovery. Like, how can you describe biological concepts without the biochemistry or the chemical steps without thinking about the physics obeyed by the chemical compounds? And how can we ever describe physics without mathematics? So that's really the magic of interdisciplinarity. The idea is that it may not matter as much what specialty you choose. You'll inevitably encounter concepts of math and science, psychology and pharmacology, philosophy and medicine, and more. So, what advice do I have for you? Well, I've boiled it down to three things. One is get your hands dirty, have a quick speed of implementation, and foster resilience. So first, don't be afraid to get your hands dirty or shy away from hard work or menial tasks. Everything you do has value. If you think about it, maybe you spend hours pipetting till you get blisters. Maybe you're wrenching away at something hoping to fix an unfixable gear. And maybe someday you want to be a CEO. I guarantee you that almost everything you learn about inventory, operations, and organization can help you in that endeavor. Maybe you volunteer in a lab cleaning petri dishes. May not feel like it, but I guarantee you being in a lab makes you that much more knowledgeable about the scientific process. Whether you realize it or not, everything you do has value, and embracing that is one of the best gifts you can give yourself. Now, every experience you have will shape you, and when you actively try to glean out what you can from that experience, you'll be that much better. So, learning that focus, discipline, and hard work is hands down the most important thing you can do for yourself. And if you learn it early, you'll definitely go far in life. Now, the second strategy is implementation. In STEM, you have to be somewhat quick on your feet. So stay up to date on the science. Working in biomechanics, I saw papers being published almost every day that completely reframed the way that we saw things. It was important to complete experiments and rule out things immediately because it was very easy to go down a rabbit hole. And then the final strategy is resilience. And this is something I learned from industry. A significant challenge of running a social enterprise is the limited funding, supports, and information that you get. So in this really high-paced environment of startup culture, I really had to learn to improvise, overcome, and adapt to ambiguity. And one skill I really refined through my time with my startup was the art of tailoring pitches for diverse audiences. And one thing that I found was that this is actually a really critical skill, and your capacity to recover from these difficulties really fostered that resilience, and I think really contributed to my own character growth. So those are some of my advices to you. So I think I'd just like to end it off on a positive note. I want to really say that the possibilities are limitless in STEM. And at the end of the day, it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is or whether you're from a high socioeconomic class or a low socioeconomic class, or whether you're Black or you're Indigenous, because really it doesn't matter. All that really matters is your curiosity and your love of learning and your wanting to learn for the pure sake of learning. And if you have that, I believe that STEM is the field for you. So I'll conclude my talk there. Thank you. And I'll open it up for any questions.
Thank you so much, John. That hit on a lot of really important points. I really like how you talked about like having an open mind. I think that's really important in STEM, being open to new opportunities. And of course, we want to have a lot of good experiences, but sometimes the challenges could be a good thing because they teach you a lot about like resilience and how to overcome different challenges. So we can just jump right into the questions now. So one question we have is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it would have to do with taking risks. As my younger self, I felt that one thing that I really like to do was stick in the comfort zone and just stay in my little bubble. I wouldn't really interact with too much people. And I found that when I was in university, I would just be very academic about the way that I approach things. So I would just go to class, take my notes, go back home. I didn't really partake in any like social activities or extracurriculars. It was only in my later undergraduate years that I sort of ventured out and started taking part in student groups and research and really got my hands dirty with these things. So I definitely think staying out of your comfort zone is a really good thing that you can do to yourself as a younger person.
Okay, and then another question that we have is, so you were a master's in science student and a medical student, and those two are really different programs, but I think they have a lot of like overlap and similarities too. So could you just maybe talk about how the applications for each program compare to one another? What were the similarities, and how should people approach the two? I'm sure since they're different programs, like a master's in science would want more like research focus, and a medical school application is more holistic. So could you just talk about like how you would approach those two different applications?
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitely there's some crosstalk between the two. I found that I started off doing my master's, so I've been really like gearing it up for a lot of applications when I think about my research. When I first started research, I did a lot of undergraduate research in wet labs. And then as I moved sort of to the end of my undergraduate career, that was when I first got exposed to the Rehab Robotics Lab and I started getting into a little bit more of the engineering. And my project was related to biomechanics and remote healthcare delivery. So these things were really some things that I felt was more so on the translational side. So being able to readily deploy these things to the clinic where patients and where clinicians can sort of interact with one another and really focus on that patient care. So going from that sort of wet lab, basic science type of environment to this more translational field has really helped me understand sort of the transition from bench to bedside of a lot of the things that we do in research. Uh, then going into medicine, I was able to further look at exactly what's being taught in terms of the diagnostics and the therapeutics that are in store during the offering of these types of um, healthcare interactions. So I think really the way that these things crosstalk is the idea that what you're doing in at least for my program, I can speak to this personally, is that what you're doing in research can really help streamline what you're doing in a more clinical um, sense. So a good example of this is the work that we're doing in telerehabilitation. So what we're doing is we're really trying to find technologies that can enable virtual clinics to be set up. You can have someone on the other side of, say, the Gulf Coast, and you could be over here in Edmonton, and you could be analyzing some of the things associated with like range of motion for people who are going through physiotherapy. So looking at that sort of tech and research development lens, you really want to help to optimize this interaction. And that feeds directly into what you're doing in programs like medicine, physiotherapy, and occupational therapy, where really you're trying to offer that care.
Okay. And let's see. So we have another question. So what inspired you to pursue a master's in telerehabilitation?
Yeah, for sure. So I think part of it was really the technology. I was extremely interested in looking at things like virtual reality and telemedicine. And as I mentioned in my talk, like since an early age, I've always really been interested in sort of playground physics and the way that people move. It's always really fascinated me that the way that people can sort of brachiate from bar to bar in the monkey bars or the sort of pendulum-like motions of a swing. And that's exactly what I'm doing in my lab because a lot of it involves sort of motion capture and trying to represent that motion in models. So, sorry, it's just gotten a little bit dark, so let me just turn on the lights here. So just to continue that thought, I was just saying that it's really important for me because I've personally found like a really big attachment to doing some of that motion capture type of work. And I think a big part of it has really been my interest for watching people move. It's just something that like I found was really cool. And I find that like even when I'm just like sitting down and observing people, just people watching, I find that I watch the way that people move. And it's something that really fascinates me because I think about how we do these things every single day. And I just get completely amazed at the way that our bodies have evolved and have really been used in like a musculoskeletal type of way to do certain things. And so, yeah, so I think that's really part of it. And then the way that you can sort of apply that knowledge into the healthcare is really something that's fascinating for me. So being able to work on function and helping people get to the best potential that they can. So when you're thinking about like athletes, I find it something that's super cool that people can train themselves and achieve peak performance. And you can use a lot of motion capture technology and things like that to really help you in aiding those goals. So yeah, that's definitely something that really motivated me.
Okay. Thank you for answering that. We have another question. It's so you mentioned talking about diverse populations. Have you faced any any challenges with this, especially when there can be a lot of misalignment between people's values?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's sort of touching on some of the things I experienced with culture shock. So coming in, I found that one of the biggest problems for me, like as a child, was the language. Now, obviously, I think that for different people, there would be different levels of challenges, and I'm not trying to say mine was more or less than others, but I think that I was fairly fortunate, granted that I came to Canada at an early age, and I was really able to pick up on the languages and things like that quite fast. But I think there were some culture shock types of moments when I started to learn about the ways that other people in engineering and just in general actually even interacted with one another, and the way that like even like subtle things and mannerisms and stuff, like for example when typically because I'm from India, like people usually use this motion to say yes and this to say no. So it's quite interesting when you see in like Western cultures, like these types of things can mean different things. And I think sometimes what it can do is it can give mixed messages, especially when you're in a professional environment and you're from a different culture. You're getting uh, different types of cultural responses and attunements to the way that you interact with people. So it's really interesting actually, but it's led to some misunderstandings, which I feel like wouldn't have been there if like we were all from the same culture. So overall, though, I think that the way to address those, the way to approach those conflicts, is to just have an open mind. And some things you can't necessarily like rectify as easily as like doing this and that, especially if there's like their habits and they're really entrenched into your very being. So I think the overall goal would be to say, like, explain to people that, you're from a different culture and it may not necessarily agree with all of the values held by like a Western civilization, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing. And I've seen this time and time again, especially working with a lot of people of color and people of different religions as well, because you can definitely see like there's sometimes that people need to go and pray. And obviously, like sometimes this gets in the way of doing certain types of work. But you have to respect these things because these are really based on differing values, and being accommodating and being open-minded about it is definitely the best thing you can do in that situation.
For sure. I completely agree. I think that's a really good answer. So I just look at the questions here. So what challenges have you found in biomedical engineering and balancing that with your medical degree, like medical career?
Yeah, for sure. That's a big thing. I think time management is really important. I think personally, like one of the biggest things, as I mentioned in my talk, has been about speed of implementation. So I typically really suggest to everyone and anyone to really do this, to try and whenever you get like a certain task or you need to do something, to do it as soon as possible, like put it into practice right away. Because one thing that I found I struggle with a lot is procrastination. So a lot of times I'll leave things and sort of let a pile of paper build up and never really get to it, just because you're sort of intimidated to a certain extent by the unsurmountable difficulty of doing a really simple task oftentimes. So I think like the speed of implementation tip is really what applies here, and doing things as soon as possible. I found that in a lot of cases in my master's, there are requirements that sometimes like you need to stay and put in extra hours, like beyond the 9 to 5 sort of standard work hour schedule, which I think is like really important, just in the sense that as an academic, you're going to get some times and some meetings that maybe you need to like coordinate with someone from a different country. So sometimes you'll have to stay up, and you'll have to stay up for like late conferences or group calls for when you're collaborating with people from different countries. And you need to have that level of flexibility, I think, especially if you're doing something like a master's, because you won't always get the same, I guess, luxuries in terms of time. And that being said, like for medicine, it's almost, it's quite similar, but I find that in med school, at least, there's a strict schedule to certain things. So what you'll find is that you make your own schedules and you really try to stick to that schedule. And when you're making that schedule for yourself, it may not always be the same as, say, for somebody else. So Google Calendars is a great tool. I found that managing my time just by sort of looking at the day and piecing out times where I can do certain things has really helped me go a long way in terms of managing that time. I also find that sometimes it's bad to over-regulate and try to plan out every single part of your day and then not allow yourselves any leeway or room for error. Because oftentimes what will happen is I might put in like a block of an hour of time to go into the lab and work on something. But then what happens is maybe that it might involve like cranking out a gear, but then that gear is broken or something. And then you'll have to find ways to rectify that. So obviously giving yourself a little bit of freedom and not sort of taking it upon yourself to sort of like self-criticize in a way for the things that you did that you weren't able to manage that time or you weren't able to complete something in the allocated time. Like I think it's an important skill to be able to sort of forgive yourself for not finishing certain things and not being too hard on yourself when you're doing research. That being said, I think that for medicine, it's a little bit more what you would see in, say, undergrad, in the sense that you want to manage your time so that you have enough time to study for exams, do assignments, things like that, which I think are standard skills that you sort of train as you go from undergrad to, say, like a more professional program anyways.
Right. Okay, so another question is, how important is your undergrad experience when applying to masters? Is there some flexibility on what like degrees you can get? How much your undergraduate should relate to your master's program?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So I did my undergrad in sciences, and then I switched to engineering for my master's. And I think that it's quite important that you don't like not necessarily you don't need the same, you don't need to worry about like the discipline that you're in, but I think you should have a good idea about the skills that you need to be successful in that particular program. So, for example, I was really interested in doing a project on biomechanics and looking at remote health. So for me, what was important in that situation was to really look at what the knowledge that I had in terms of my neuroscience background and my physiology background, and then apply that to the engineering field. So biomechanics is a good example because I find that a lot of the things that you know in physiology and doing some neuroscience is the ways that your muscles and your nervous system sort of work together to sort of guide you through your or navigate your everyday life. And I think that's actually one of the things that in biomedical engineering is really looked upon as a critical skill. To have that medical knowledge is really important when you're looking at biomechanics. So I think having that anatomy knowledge, and I had to read up a lot before applying to my master's program, obviously, because when you're taking on this project for 2 years, you're hoping that you have some of the skills that you need to really tackle the issue. So I would definitely think about it more of a skills-based approach than an academic approach. So you don't necessarily need, say, a background in engineering to apply to biomedical engineering, but I would argue that you need a little bit more of the practical skills, and you should have a little bit of theoretical knowledge about the type of project that you want to take part in when you're in your master's. Because a lot of stuff you can learn on the go, but I think the other part is using what you have in your inventory of skills that you learned during undergrad. And it'll differ from program to program. But for engineering, I find that one of those skills is like the more practical side of things. And it'll differ based on how quickly you're able to learn. But for me, like I'm not that quick of a learner, but I do work harder, I feel. So I was able to sort of make up for that.
Okay, yeah, and I think it really ties into like when you talked about interdisciplinary knowledge, having your background in the sciences really helped you with like biomedical engineering. So there's also another question. Was there ever a time you felt like giving up, and how did you overcome that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of times that I felt that I wanted to give up and maybe this wasn't the way for me. So, just to share a little bit more of my experiences. So, it was in my first year, I had to withdraw from a class. And so for your master's, typically you would have to do 2 or 3 courses just for the credit. And I found that I decided to do like an engineering course, which was a little bit more heavy on the statistics and mathematics. And what I found was like I had to withdraw from it because it was way too much for me. I couldn't handle a lot of it because you needed a undergraduate engineering background to really grasp some of these concepts. So there was a limit that I realized that I found with going into biomedical engineering, the idea that there are certain things that you need a lot more time to grasp. And so I was at odds with that, and I found that talking with my supervisor helped me a lot to overcome that. Um, and I think that's actually the biggest factor in all of this. It was the fact that I had a really great supervisor and I had really great lab mates. So having that strong social support systems really helped me to navigate my pathway, even though I withdrew from that class. The next question was, what other courses could I take to make up for those credits? And I found that there were other rehab relevant courses, which were more individualized, which were more focused on in terms of what I could do that I was able to pursue. And those ones, it was a lot more fair, in my opinion, to my understandings and to what I've learned as a master's student.
Yeah, I really like that answer. I completely agree that a lot of people, especially when they enter university, it's a whole new environment. There's so much more that you need to know, so much more homework. And having a really good support network and finding people that you can connect to and talk to is a really great way to just keep going. And like, it's a really good way to overcome challenges when you can connect with others. So I really like that answer. Um, we have a question. How can you find mentors and network with others in your field of interest? What advice do you have for networking and finding mentors?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I think that mentors definitely go a long way in terms of the types of opportunities that you're exposed to, and also in terms of the way that you grow as a person. I think my advice for finding mentors would be to attend a lot of um, review sessions and things that you're doing in class. Like in your undergraduate career, you might find there's certain professors and certain TAs that you notice are really good at what they do, or they're doing some really interesting work. So really like pay attention to what they're doing and see if that's something that piques your interest. And one thing that I did was I would oftentimes after class, I would stick around and ask questions with my professors and really try to understand like what they were doing in their field of research. And another really good way was for me to just go to different professional conferences. So we had like summer students research days and things like that, where you can basically present some of your research that you did in undergrad. And I found that a lot of professors attend these types of events, and you can go around and look at what other students are doing, and you can try and figure out what sort of research is being done and what type of research is interesting to you. And if you find something that's interesting to you, you can look up who or which lab is doing these types of research, and then you can approach those types of people in that way. For me, I think getting to my current mentor, it was really just serendipity. I was just scrolling through an opportunity page on the U of A, and I was able to find my supervisor, and I somehow applied to it like on the nick of time. It was really late in my fourth year, and I somehow got an interview, not an interview, like a quick 10-minute meeting with him. And he basically explained, like, this is what we're doing, and we need someone to do some of the data collection. And it was really like just something that I felt was serendipity in the sense that you didn't even know like what you were going in for. But during this 10-minute thing, I was able to get sort of pseudo summer position. And then after that summer position, I was really able to work hard and show to my supervisor that I was able to complete the tasks and do them in a really fast and efficient and effective manner. And then as a result, what you do is you sort of build that trust and you become quite confident with doing certain things in the lab. And then eventually it'll get to a point where your supervisor almost has like no other choice but to accept you in the sense that you're working there full time, or like you're working there for like a lot of time and you've got these skills that others don't readily have. So I definitely think like volunteering and putting your foot in the door by summer studentships has really gone a long way for me. And that's the way that I've really been able to build that rapport and trust with my mentor. And now I feel like we have a really good relationship as a result of sort of constant communication and being able to do certain projects, being able to deal with conflict, and being comfortable with sort of showing your vulnerabilities to your supervisor. I think that's really gone a long way for me because there are so much times where I felt like I wanted to give up or maybe engineering wasn't the way for me. But my supervisor was with me every inch of the way and he was able to work things out. And being able to do that one-on-one has been quite enlightening and it's been quite a rewarding experience for me because I've learned a lot of things about mentorship from my mentor. So it's a really cyclical sort of pattern. And I think that this is a really good way to grow and a great way to learn.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, especially the part about like vulnerability. Just like being humble enough to admit when you don't know things is a really great way to learn as a person and to like connect with others. And then I really like how you also said how you worked really hard and like the roles that you got and they didn't have a choice but to put you on. I really agree because just doing your best work and showing people that you're capable and that really helped you like get more opportunities and build better connections. So that's really great advice. Just whenever you get an opportunity, do the best work that you can in that, and because you don't know where it can lead you and the different relationships you can build. So yeah, um, this is a good question. What do you think is the most interesting part about biomedical engineering, and how does the specialization differ from other types of engineering?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way that the undergrad biomedical engineering program works is basically it's specialization under mechanical engineering, at least at the University of Alberta. But in terms of graduate school, there's a Department of Biomedical Engineering, which is basically open, which is offered by the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry and the Faculty of Engineering. So there's a lot of people from both the clinical side of things as well as the engineering side of things who come there as and do biomedical engineering as an after degree program. So a lot of different ways that you can get into biomedical engineering. But the thing that I felt was the most interesting to me was really the technology and the lab itself. So being able to see some of the extremely exciting and new things that we're doing here at the University of Alberta has really been what drove me to pursue biomedical engineering. So the one that I'm a part of, the Rehabilitation Robotics Lab, it's a part of 4 other labs, which are part of the SMART network or the Sensory Motor Adaptive Rehabilitation Network here at the University of Alberta. And they do a lot of really cool things. They have talks where they talk about robotics, they talk about prosthetics, um, different types of ways that you can integrate soft robotics. So, like these types of tissue like structures and materials, and then use those in the development of robots. It's really cool work. And then there's a lot of work that's being done in terms of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which is something a lot of computer science students and sort of more mathematics based students really like and want to do a lot of work in that as well. So from an engineering lens, it's quite captivating in terms of the things that you can do with the technology and the things that you can get make and create from a more from a medical lens. It's really cool in terms of the applications that you have. So being able to offer prosthetics for patients, as well as being able to create sort of what I do, which is make virtual reality simulations for wheelchair users and other people who are doing rehab. So um, all of these from a medical lens, I find is super engaging and interesting in the sense that a lot of the therapies and the treatments that are available right now is not really that interesting for people. So what you get is people are sort of dejected. And there's this really good talk that I went to, which sort of described how someone was like on the verge of death, and basically they were really tired of like the drugs and of the other therapies that they were getting. But then what happened was they basically gave that person VR goggles, and they basically showed them like some of the things that you do like in everyday life, and they were able to play games and really engage with what they saw. And that was just so eye-opening and captivating for them that they were able to sort of really benefit from that VR type of therapy in a way that like conventional sort of drugs and other therapeutics really didn't do. So that was something that I found was really cool in the sense that you can really use VR and you can use these technologies in a way that really captivates the patients and really makes them want to get better and makes them want to sort of get back to their normal health. Because a lot of times the language and rhetoric in like clinical scenarios is negative, and you see people sort of approaching like less and less into less and less good states as a result of them just not being able to see sort of the value and the purpose and the joy in returning to a healthy life. So I think that's something that VR and tech has really been able to do, and something that's really captivated me and make me want to go into biomedical engineering, because it's really the future of medicine.
Okay, thank you for that response. And then we have another good question. Since you have studied in many fields of STEM, does the experience or knowledge change how you see the world?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Since you have studied in many fields of STEM, does the experience or knowledge that you gain from the different, like all the different academic and like research backgrounds that you have, how does it change how you see the world?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I think that's definitely happened. There's a lot of transferable skills that you learn, especially when you're doing so much presentations and things like that. So I'll talk a little bit actually about my experience in industry and sort of with a startup. So one of the things that we did in our lab was we started up a company that basically looked at trying to bring a fitness tracker to patients so that they can sort of look at their own fitness data while they were rolling around on a wheelchair or on a bike. So it's essentially like a fitness device that you strap onto the wheel, and you'll get information about things like acceleration and velocity and cadence, and give you these indications when you're overexerting yourself or when you need to take a break. So I think doing work like that has really been uh, a lot different than what you would see in a traditional sort of Masters of Science program, where a lot of what you're doing is you're just doing experiments in the lab. But being able to do work in the real world sort of has given me an appreciation of some of the things that go on in businesses and in terms of looking at especially like medical devices and the ways that they're patented and the ways that you can sort of allow certain devices to be employed and deployed into the world. And you can see sometimes there's benefits with them, but other times there's also like disadvantages with them in the sense that you can get just devices in the market and then they don't really do anything, or they start actually malfunctioning. So I've been able to see a lot of these different types of things, and I don't want to like give any like details just because I don't want to like infringe on any confidentiality. But essentially, I think you learn a lot about failure in the sense that you're in a company and you're in a very uncertain environment. you don't have too much funds, you don't have too much experience, and you're just sort of on your own, and you have to wing it a lot of the times. You have to go up and give a speech in front of maybe like hundreds of investors, and you sometimes like you'll just sort of freeze up on the spot. But at the end of the day, you just have to wing it and sort of explain to them like the benefits of your product and see what the response is. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not, but it's just a factor of resilience. And I think that resilience is really what transfers over to some of the other things that you do, say in the lab, where you're doing experiments and they might not necessarily work, or maybe you're in like say a medical situation where you're doing um, like you're trying to learn for study for some like something like your OSCEs, which is like a practical exam that you have to do, and you have to like do like you have to take history and you have to do physical exams and things like that, and then you learn about resilience in the sense that you don't necessarily always get the right answer all the time. Sometimes you'll have to try a few different things with the patient before you finally get that answer. So I think it's something that goes across the disciplines in that sense.
And I think it'd be really interesting to ask about. So you talked about being part of a company. That's a really unique experience. I feel like there's a lot of people who are interested in entrepreneurship, but it could be pretty daunting, especially as a university student or even younger. So, what like advice would you have for younger people who are interested in entrepreneurship? How did you learn more when you're starting out your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of it has to do with sort of your initiative and your ability to take initiative. So for me, it was thanks to a lot of support was given to me, thanks to my mentor, as well as some of my lab mates who really made it happen. And I think that's something that's really important when you're starting out a company. You need a good team, and you need a team that doesn't sort of give up. We've had that, like sometimes like what you'll have is you have a team and then some people aren't pulling their weight or they start losing interest. And what you have to do is during those times, you have to sort of have that really strong, solid core team and explain like what are the reasons for having like certain people invested or not invested. And I think the biggest thing that you can do is sort of say no, to say like maybe this isn't the way to go when you're in a company. And a lot of the time it's very dangerous and you feel very unsafe, because the fact is like if your company is not willing to take a risk, um, you start really getting into sort of dangerous territory in the sense that you might get a loss of income. You might start to lose money, and you might start to lose, like, especially if the startup is all you have and you've invested so much into it. A lot of the times, like, you won't get the same results out. So I think that's a really big fear, and it scares a lot of people off, and for correct reasons, of course. I'm not saying that like everyone needs to be like those people who put all of their money into that startup and try to really get it growing, because a lot of the times that might not be the best decision and you might become financially insecure. So I think the way that we sort of structured it, and the University of Alberta is really trying to do this to sort of help startups and student startups especially, is they have an accelerator that they're partnering currently with a business incubator, with Tech Edmonton. So they're really focusing in on health startups and trying to give these types of students who have ideas to commercialize with more resources and more help to really help them get on the market and help them hit the ground sort of running. And as a student, you really do need a lot of drive, and you need a lot of initiative. You need to put a lot of work. You need to put a lot of time into it. Otherwise, like, it's a really daunting thing to do. Like, because I know a lot of people like to do entrepreneurship in a way that's sort of just like it looks good on your resume and your CV. Like, you don't really have to do much. But I think that there is a lot that can be done with entrepreneurship because you're actually making an impact now. It's beyond sort of what you're doing in the lab, and now you're, for the first time, you're sort of introducing it to the world, and seeing what consumers have to say about it, seeing what in reality, like our wheelchair, so for our case, were wheelchair users really able to use this device in a way that helped them, or was it maybe not? And, part of that is something that you're doing in science. Like you want to test and see if consumers like this product or not. And in order to do that, just like you would in science, you need to do an experiment. And that experiment is sort of putting it on the market and seeing how much people buy it and use it and benefit from it. And if not too much people are buying it, not too much people are using it, or they're using it and then they're getting poor results or low compliance, then you have to realize that this is not a good product and you have to realize it's time to stop.
Okay, thank you for that, guys. That was a really good answer. So we're nearing the end of the presentation, and that was a great discussion, a lot of answers and a lot of questions. So I'm just going to wrap up the session today. Thank you so much to everyone who attended, and thank you so much, John, to you. That was an amazing discussion, a lot of great points, and I feel like it was really inspirational for all the university students or some high school students watching. So thank you again to everyone joining us, and I hope you guys all have a good evening.
Thanks again.